After 25, 30 years of experiencing the finest quality firearms, that existed in the world, I had the desire to create something that to me would transcend time, create something so fantastic that not only when it was finished in this generation, but 50, 100, 200, 300 years down the road, somebody can look back and say, these craftsmen existed at the turn of the 21st century to create something so exquisite that it'll be remembered forever. In 2008, Joe Connolly from the Colt Custom Shop was at the Vegas Gun Show. And I approached Joe and I said, let's create something special. I said, the Colt Single Action is symbolic of American gun collecting. And I said, we need it done by the best engraver that we can at the time. The finest engraver in the country right now is Winston Churchill. And I think it's something that management should consider. And I would say, sadly to say, but it took them a couple of years to, I think it was 2010. And, finally they realized that this was going to be something very special, and they went along with it. The Colt was introduced in 1873. I wanted something that was a black powder frame, which Colt happened to be making at this time, primarily with the black powder frame for the originality of the Colt. At the same time, Winston and I talked about, well, what barrel length would seem to be the finest? And the 4 3/4 was too short, the 7 1/2 was too long. The 5 1/2 was close, but in laying out the scroll and on the barrel and how we wanted it to flow, it seemed like 6 inches was the best length to have. So we requested an in the white gun, 6 inches in length for the barrel. Of course, the most famous caliber in the single action would be .45 Colt, so we asked for that. And then I wanted a special serial number, which they agreed to, and the serial number of the gun, which I wanted, happened to be Churchill No. 1. I discussed it with Winston. I said, Winston, if we're going to do a Colt single action, which is the Frontier, the 6-shooter, whatever you wanted to call it, the cowboy and Indian gun, I wanted a theme that was appropriate to the handgun, that would continue the evolution of the idea of when it was used, how it was used, but not in a negative way. I wanted to put the legacy of the American Indian and the legacy of the American cowboy, put them on, combine that, one side cowboy side, one side Indian side, and not in a adversary position, but what they stood for. So I talked to Winston, again, my ideas. I would say he was more than open to what my suggestions were. And, and I said on the Indian side, let's do the species that are sacred to the Indian, the buffalo, the eagle, the cougar or puma, the wolf, and so on and so forth. Let's incorporate all that into the handgun on the right side, and then on the left side, let's make a tribute to the American cowboy. The bronco rider, the cowboy riding, the steers, and so on and so forth. And he thought it was a great idea. I basically spelled out what I wanted, and this particular project he was very open about, and it was something that you would have to know Winston and his style of engraving, but it was also something that it was the first gun probably in his life where he spent some time sketching and drawing before the actual cutting of the gun itself. I wanted to go with Arabesque scroll, which over the years became known as Churchill Arabesque scroll, and so on. And to me, it just fit the style, the flow of the handgun, the way the Colt single action is, the various portions of the Colt handgun, and it's something we discussed quite a bit. They did openly accept how I might want it done, such as, to me, in a handgun and so on and so forth, everything should flow towards the muzzle. You don't want animals running backwards necessarily. You don't want scroll running backwards, except in the case at the front of the muzzle, which meets scroll going forward. And there were certain times when the top of the frame by the sight, Winston had the scroll coming this way, and I said, no, Winston, we want it flowing. Like when you point the gun, you want it flowing forward. more than receptive. It was kind of a joy to be involved with the creation, because when this project was started, I wanted something where not only the firearm itself, but the encasement of the firearm was very important to me. So many times you have an absolutely fantastic firearm, but it sits on a shelf, or there's nothing to go with it. And I wanted this to be different. I wanted this to be something where you could open up a case, view not only the engraved Colt Single Action, but view the accoutrements around the gun and say that they complemented each other. It was the entire package. That's what I was looking for.
I was always making stuff from very little, and I remember my much older brother, the oldest in the family, 7 years older, when I was very small, almost pre-memory, made a little rocket ship, probably modelled on a Sabre jet or something like that, out of a curled up leaf, a piece of shrimp shell and a needle sticking out the front. So a shrimp shell for a cockpit and a rolled up leaf for the tapered fuselage. And that is a dried leaf that had rolled, curled. And I just couldn't get over it. It still exists, I know where it is. And I just always just loved it and could think of nothing else but trying to do that sort of thing. And so I tried to do that sort of thing ever since I can remember. And so I continued on an upward climb in my skills. You can't just make something and have it work. It has to be calculated and engineered. And so I loved the challenge of that. One of the later sets I made was a Colt Single Action, rusty like a boat anchor, which all the guns I engraved came in absolutely relic condition. But I made them better than new, with files. And I built this set with screwdrivers and everything, and it was one of the pictures I had with me when I came from Australia to the US. In 2007, the Reno show, I had something to display, a little Kentucky rifle that I'd made, and a couple of knives and lots of photos. I had a rather threadbare display, but I was treated insanely well. And so I had that rifle with me when I visited Winston, at the insistence of Larry Wilson, the author. And so I was in my element.
When Damien came over to visit Winston at the time, he had a miniature little flintlock rifle that he wanted to show Winston.
I came and saw him, and we did hit it off, and he liked my stuff. But I suppose it was the picture of this cased set that I'd made, which was pretty nice, not like this one, but it was pretty good, that gave him the idea I could do the work. And he had the physical evidence of my little Kentucky rifle, which embodies, of course it was engraved at that 1/5 scale as well. And it did show that I was in that market. When Tom put the project to Winston, and they were looking for someone to make the case, and there were a few in contention, it seems, Winston was good enough to make sure that I was the one, or to at least that I was investigated.
And when he left, Winston got on the phone to me and said, "Tom, we found someone to do the case. I've seen his work, and I think artistic, competent enough to do whatever we want done with the case." So I was pleased to hear it. I contacted Damien. Damien did some sketching on the case, concept, idea, initial value, and so on and so forth. We talked about design. We talked about obtaining the wood for the case, what we had in mind. And he was familiar with Winston's work initially on the gun, and so on and so forth.
When Tom first called me, and when Tom and I first spoke on the phone, I got an idea of what he wanted, but he was very good at laying open. He wanted to see what I could come up with. It wasn't, I want this box and the corners have to be square and it's got to be a real rectangle, there was none of that. It was, I want a case, and if there's imagination of yours you can apply to it, please do it. That was the impression I got. I can't remember any exact words, but I knew I had license to go and pick up a pencil and start sketching. And so I started working in Australia on, well, taking it further to the stage where I built a clay mock-up, full size. This is sculpting clay over the top of a wooden frame, and made something that externally looked close to exactly like the box. There are photos of it. And then I took a mould from that clay model that I had made, because it had an interior surface as well, and I made a complete fiberglass mock-up of the case, and brought it to Reno in 2009, where I met up with Tom. We'd planned it, and we spent a very pleasurable several days, I suppose. I had my miniature Kentucky rifle with me at the time as well, so that went down well among the people I showed, and Tom liked it, and it perhaps gave him a little confidence that I was the man, because it was sticking his neck out, and so we hit it off in that way. And that was about the point where started the 20-odd month process of getting a green card. That's how long it takes.
So we had brought Damien over, I believe it was around, 2010, 2011, something like that.
And that's where I started work here, about a half hour's drive from Winston's place, across the mountain basically. There's just a range between us. And I found the perfect place that I'm still in.
So he was in the area, and making the trips back during the engraving of the gun, Damien and I got to know one another, become friends. In Damien coming over and seeing what he was doing, whether it was with the case or some of his previous engraving, Winston and I both sensed that this was somebody that was almost a once-in-a-lifetime artist to get to meet and to get to know. And in that terminology and Winston and my discussion, Winston would often say to me, "Tom, I really feel that Damien is the Michelangelo of the 21st century." He said, "The man can do anything." He said, "I don't care if it's working with wood, metal, steel, anything." And I wholeheartedly agreed with Winston. I mean, I have not encountered another human being in the firearms industry, whether it be an engraver, a stocker, any type of artist, that has the mental ability to tackle a problem or create something that he wants to create and have the ability to go forward and do it.
So I had the oval concept for the inside. I realized if I drew the right oval, I could fit it around the display in that. And then I had to put a skin on the oval. And so I went to a place in Kittery, Maine, with a very amenable guy, and he found a pair of shotgun blanks that would make 2 button 4-end stocks each. And the wood was spectacular. I took these home and spent 2 or 3 days looking at them. And this is 6-8 hours a day with a white pencil, just trying to figure out where the alignment of these many planks that I had to bandsaw out of. I think there are 32 planks in the whole thing. I did an awful lot of thinking, was lucky with the wood, and was able to keep the flow of grain apparently flowing across panels. But piece by piece, I put it together, matching them up, and then carving by hand with chisels and planes and files. And so at that point it was a rough box, fairly smooth on the outside, and I was delighted to see it. Just as it got, I could see that I was going to be able to do it. Inside the lid of the case is a very large, almost winged inlay with the Colt prancing on the globe as on top of the dome in Hartford. Using a piece of 8-gauge plate, that's a bit over 1/8 of an inch, steel plate that is, I drew out the design on it, machined all the parts out where the gold would be going, and all the parts that would be cut away to leave the tendrils flying. But the finished box is at the end of a very long process, from pencil and paper design to clay model to fiberglass mock-up to sawing out and fabrication, as well as the finishing and the filling it with the accessories. But it's just a lot of very carefully designed little planks glued together. Boat building fashion, really, is what it was. Everything laminated, attempting to keep it stable, because something cut out of a block of wood like this, it could turn around and look at you in terms of warping and twisting. So it's just the end of a very complex and long process.
Looking at the progress of the gun, amazing, counting the hours, visiting, talking, typical reaction I always had with Winston as far as enjoying a project with him. He enjoyed working for me, with me. However, I started to notice maybe 2013, 2014, that the quality was there, but it was taking Winston more time. But I could kind of sense that that Winston was slowing down. And the last time I came back, there was a definite reduction in what he had done as far as coverage on the handgun. Yeah, when I talked with Winston towards the end of this project, it definitely became evident that this was going to be his last work. And in that discussion, his comment to me was, "Tom, I want this to be the best and the last masterpiece that I ever create." Winston, not only is this your last gun, but it's the end of the engraving for you. And I said, to me, one of the most iconic pieces of art in American West is James Earl Fraser's End of the Trail. And I said to Winston and Damien both, I said, why don't we put the end of the trail up in that shield area as a tribute to Winston being the end of his trail, but at the same time combining everything about the gun in that one single area. I wasn't surprised when I had a call. I was living in Florida at the time, and it was Winston on the phone, and I remember the call distinctly. He said, "Tom," he said, "we've been involved with this project now going on, not counting, working with Colt 7-8 years. And he said, I've reached a point where I can sense in my brain and in my ability to engrave that I cannot continue anymore if we want the quality to stay where it's at." I said, "Winston, I expected this day." I said, "It's kind of like the American Pie song when Buddy Holly died, and the music stopped, and it was basically a situation where that day, the engraving stopped." I thanked Winston for what he had done. I said, "I fully understand it, Winston." I said, "As a friend and a patron, I appreciate your honesty in coming to me and telling me that I can't continue if you want excellence." And that meant a lot to me, and it meant a lot to him. That led, of course, to a conversation with both Winston and Colt. Well, where do we go from here? So I went back to Vermont. Winston and I and Damien sat down. I said, "Damien, would you consider taking up where Winston left off, looking at his designs, using the style of the scroll we want, elevating it any way you wanted?" Because at that time, Damien had been doing a very special gun for Jerry Fisher. Damien had used Arabesque scroll and intertwined it with gold line work, and the work was just absolutely phenomenal. I had seen that when I had come back. Besides working on the case, he had these various projects going on. And I could sense then that there was no doubt in my mind that turning it over to Damien was the right thing to do. I talked to Colt about it. I explained the situation. They were on board. So starting, I believe it was I don't have the dates in front of me, but I think it was 2016, 15, 16, in that range. Everything was turned over to Damien.
I was confident, but terribly excited, because it was a huge challenge to pick up where someone's chisel had left the steel the day before. Well, it wasn't the day before, but it was the week before. And continue it and make it look right. That was difficult in the first place. Arabesque scroll is very hard to draw. And so, yeah, to come to match that was a challenge, but no, I never short of self-confidence, I suppose, in that sort of thing. But it's confidence that I won't stop until it's right. And I had precedent on my side. I'd done some good stuff, so I knew. At the top of the strap, there's a shield-shaped section just behind the hammer, and we have the end of the trail by James Earl Fraser there, and it's as close a copy as I could do to this 18-foot-tall plaster sculpture that still resides in the Kansas City Cowboy Hall of Fame. It's especially evocative of the subject matter of the pistol, given that it is Winston coming to his end in the engraving world, and it has Indian life on one side, it has cowboys on the other side. Because we generally see this sculpture in isolation or in a gallery or behind with someone's lounge room wall behind it, I had to think up a scene. So I've got a hard rock desert scene. He's climbing out of Death Valley or something like that. But what I very much wanted to do was to have the drama in the background of the hills being silhouetted against a darkening sky, but to have the sky ever darkening toward the upper horizon or toward the top of the picture, where I very carefully gradated it so that as it reaches the top, it's jet inky black. But the rest of the scene is carved in full relief. The overall composition of the side panels, each of which have 3 animals on it, or 3 inlays, I arrived at it not by trial and error, but through experimentation. I had Winston's general direction of flow coming down from the top. On the right-hand side, it changes because the screw heads are big there. On the left-hand side, you just have the ends of the screw. And so the design necessarily changes more than you think. It looks the same, but it's nothing like it. So with the direction of scroll laid out, I had to leave holes for the animals to appear. And the scroll was only arrived at through getting what was a sinuous, stimulating flow along the side of the gun. And the beasts had to align with that, as in not interfere with that. It's some hours of work to arrive at it, but once arrived at, then I can draw the scroll very specifically around that positioning of animals. But I have to know the layout first. And not crowding things is a very big thing, allowing the movement to go on. But having the animals big enough and still having scroll flowing past them, it's a huge exercise in compromise and balance. So there is a fair amount of lettering on the gun, and I made choices, and I ran through these with Tom, the lettering being terribly important to the overall look of it. And on the top of the barrel, there's the original factory roll engraving, and it's a specific form of it that was around the turn of the century, I think, which was a shorter address and didn't interfere with the engraving design. The finishes on the pistol, metal finishes, very important. Design elements themselves are a very particular degree of luster that I arrived at and attempted to get even across the gun, because relief engraving, too highly polished, disappears. It's just a mass of reflections. So if I had the clean surface, unengraved surfaces, very highly polished, then it'd just destroy the look of it, in that it would just reflect everywhere. And by people's reaction, it pleases people to have this soft satin glow on the metal. The design is more highly polished, and that's on purpose. Of course, in a lot of places it is contrasting with a matte background, matte-ed background. The breech end of the barrel is a very intensive piece of work, because it includes the cartouche that surrounds the gold inlaid Colt roll stamping, and while it's just basically a straight-sided oval, it's making something plain into something a bit different that echoes and feeds into its surrounding design. There's an illustration that can be made of the comparison of this sort of work and what is the lot of a factory engraver. And we took the finished case and pistol down to Colt to have it recertified, to have it certified as, and then actually signed out of the factory. And that's when they signed it out, when it was finished. The hammer's a very intensive piece of work with some unique aspects to it, in the true sense of the word. You don't see it elsewhere. And it was a very intensively thought out piece of design, and something that I had to make work, because what I did could very easily not have worked had I placed it wrongly. And I spent 300 hours on that hammer, and it probably shows to anyone that knows, but one of the engravers at Colt asked me how long I might have spent on the hammer, because they're craftsmen, they know exactly what it takes. And I told him 300 hours, and he turns around to his boss and said, "You expect me to engrave a whole gun in 300 hours? This guy spent 300 on the hammer." And it was already checkered. So I did redo the checkering. But yes, that is a comparison. It's very valid, and puts in a very good light the work that Steve Kamek, the guy who mentioned that, can do in 300 hours on a whole gun. But it does show that we're in a different market here, different expectations, and a whole other level of application. The way I designed the bottom strap and the reasoning behind it is that in the past, engravers didn't sign their work. In fact, they weren't allowed to sign their work. Winston and Ken Hunt also just broke that tradition to pieces, and it's never been the case since. But and I inherited that opinion fully formed, and this being the project that it is, as in an all-out attempt to get the best work out of three people putting their minds to it. To me, having the names large like that, Tom wouldn't have his on it, but having both of our names large like that was totally in keeping with the pistol. And I rationalised it at the time that any painter who does a work, you can stand 8 feet away and see their signature on the painting, right in front of you. Why can't an engraver sign the same way? And so, I mean, there is a limit to how loudly you proclaim your presence in the work, but I think it's very tasteful and totally necessary. And in the end, it does look pretty good. And it minimises it, but it's one of the parts that I do really like.
Winston had put roughly around 2,200 hours, something like that, in the gun at that time. And I think Damien proceeded between then and the end of the gun to put another 3,300 plus hours in it. The case involved, I think, 3,600 hours, so there was a little over 9,200 hours in the project over the time. But overall, the entire project took close to 10 years plus from inception to completion with the case. And one of the things I can compare this entire project to is a Fabergé egg. And it's something that if you've seen the eggs and the Russian czars that produce these eggs, usually for their wives, it was not only the egg, but it was the entire package, okay? The egg was phenomenal. The craftsmen were phenomenal. Of their time, they're absolutely beautiful. They're ornate, which I didn't want an ornateness in this particular gun, but as far as the comparison, to me the Fabergé egg has an encasement. Usually it's inside something or it's on a beautiful stand and so on and so forth. And that's what I felt this Colt was. To me it's like the Fabergé egg of the Colt Single Action. It embodies the quality, the excellence, the superb engraving, the wood, the checkering, and then it's displayed in a case that's out of this world. I mean, you would have to handle each turn screw, you would have to handle the cleaning rod. Look at the emblem that Damien did in the inside lid of the case. It's just phenomenal. The wood that was used, the fit, the whole concept, the design of the case, not going with your typical hinges. Everything in Damien's head that he thought about to produce this case just speaks of excellence. There's nothing like it in the engraving world, and I don't think there's anything like this particular Colt in the Colt Single Action world. And I feel a tremendous satisfaction personally that I was blessed with the ability to create this through the hands of Damien Connolly and Winston Churchill.
There was no reason for me to take any less than the time it took to do it as I wanted it. And that's a really big thing. I discovered it was a really big thing. And it is the case that a lot of people do absolutely perfect, beautiful work, but it is limited. And that goes for whatever you're making. It needs to be a challenge. Without a challenge, I'm not fired up to do it. And it's the challenge keeps me interested, even if there's a lot of donkey work in between. I discovered something then, and I've tried to remember it.
When the gun itself was finished, not the case, we did take the gun down to the Colt factory. Damien, Winston, and I drove down, and we presented it to all the heads of Colt. Steve Kamek and John Pease were there from the Colt Custom Shop, and we presented the Colt to them, and needless to say, they were impressed. It was beyond their wildest dreams. I firmly believe that it is the finest Colt that was ever produced, that will be ever produced. But I just feel that the time was right for the Colt factory, for Damien and Winston, for myself, to create something that like I said, it'll transcend history. I think it really is something that's very special in the firearms collecting field. I don't know of any other single action from a standard of quality, design, whatever you want to call it. To me, it's the best.